Hello again, and this is the third book reading. I am going to be doing Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 today. I also have, I believe, Latoya Wilson. One moment here, let me check the schedule, make sure I have the right. Yes, Latoya Wilson will be the featured author for today. I have 3 posts coming, so I'm going to go ahead and begin Chapter 4 of Dolor and Shadow. The other book readings, in case you missed them, are available on my channel for YouTube, which you can subscribe to, and they are also available on my website. You'll find them on my blog, and I think that's it. So this is Dolor and Shadow, Chapter 4, and we're back in Lorlenalin. Kallan breathed in the fresh morning air from her balcony. The clear skies permitted an unobstructed view of the jagged precipice that plunged into the waters below, where the ocean's waves slammed into the mountainside. Unyielding, Lorlenalin's foundation stood strong against the sea. Kallan grinned. The scent of sea and spring and holiday clung to the winds that tossed her hair about. She was certain she could smell cook's cloudberry glaze drift over holiday breads and custards. The feasts of Astramonach. Her smile widened, and in a sudden bout of energy she sprinted into her bower. Taking up her boots, she dropped to the elaborate chest that ran flush with the foot of her bed and pulled them on. Still grinning, Kallan grabbed the sword from her bed and fled from the room, leaving the main doors of her chamber wide open. Down the hallway, Kallan ran down the steps to the main corridor that encircled the great hall. Inside, the servants and cook were preparing the last of the delights for travel. Nearly 300 wives had already left with their children in a small guard. Today she and her father would be leaving to join them in Gunir, located on the other side of the Alfheim wood, where the northernmost tip of Lake Vanir met the forest. There, on the eve of Astramonach, they would break bread with King Drui and his kin. Still, she had time to get in a morning's worth of swordplay. Too eager to find a leaf in the city's hell of records, and too impatient to stop when one of the kitchen servants offered her a handful of cloudberries, Kallan dashed down the hall to the courtyard, which buzzed with a liveliness only an approaching holiday could bring. Okay, this is really just... The first warm spring day had lured everyone into the streets, where Dolor women were busy decorating Lorlenalin in the festival colors of Astramonach. Piles of branches bursting with pussy willows lay beside children who had followed their mothers into the sun-filled courtyard. Strips of fabrics dyed with bright yellows, reds, blues, and green hung balls of evergreen sprigs. Wreaths of flowers and wild branches covered one side of the battlement. It would take the next day to hang the rest, just in time for the holiday. Kallan ran past the pile of branches and skirted around the children running about before cutting across the vast center square that brimmed with the village life. Everywhere Alfheim bustled, doubling up their chores to complete them in time for the celebrations. Decorations trimmed the streets, feeding the excitement that flowed through the city. At the town center, beside the vast fountain, Frey's pole stood. Like a beacon, it fed the people's enthusiasm as it waited, erected for the feasts of Astramonach. All week, Kallan had stopped to gaze at the ribbons and colors that decorated Frey's pole. Today, Kallan paid no mind as she hurried toward the barracks on the farthest end of the square. The stone streets, the distant plink of the smith's hammer, and the stables did nothing to deter her from her goal. With ease, she fastened the sword to her waist as she came to stop at the barracks door. Breathe. Kallan eased her excitement and slowed the beating of her heart until her hands were steady and her nerves unyielding. She unsheathed her sword and joined the pure ring of the metal, and she placed her hand to the door. Kallan pushed on the wood, and the door swung wide. She raised her sword above her head, angled the tip to shield her face, and entered. The room appeared empty. Swords hung on the stone walls. Barrels of training swords remained undisturbed in a corner, where a line of dummies, beaten to all sorts of conditions, spanned the farthest wall. The occasional round shield rested in waiting, propped against the wall. Streaks of sunlight poured through the windows onto the floor. She watched the sun dust settle. Empty. Still holding her sword in position, Kallan returned her hand to the door, drew in a long, deep breath, and threw her body into the door, slamming it hard into Dagon on the other side. Dagon howled, and Kallan swung the sword down toward Dagon's red head. He raised his sword and blocked her strike, forcing Kallan to take several steps back. She poised her blade, blocking her torso as Dagon stepped from behind the door and matched her position. "Princess," Dagon said with a grin. Buried beneath the wild red mass of beard and hair, he lunged, thrusting the blade for her shoulder. "Kallan," she corrected, swinging her blade for the exposed artery in Dagon's leg. Her sword crashed into his, and Dagon bore his blade up, forcing Kallan to leap back. She swung her blade up for his neck, then down for his head as Dagon moved with her. He deflected her sword and mirrored her attacks, swinging his blade down as Kallan raised her palm flush with the end of her blade. She blocked his attack, then shoved it aside and smashed her pommel up into his face. As Dagon stumbled back, blood gushed from his broken nose. Knowing his skill with the blade, Kallan gave no time to recover. She swung for his shoulder as he dabbed at his nose. Dagon blocked her attack, then hooked her hilt with his crossguard. He reached across her arms and grabbed her hilt, which held her in place as he spun and slammed his back into her front. "Thank you," he said, giving a yank and relinquishing the sword from her hands. He shifted his weight, and Kallan fell to the ground in a heap. Dagon threw back his head and laughed long and loud as Kallan started grinning from the floor. "Think you have time to smile, princess?" he jeered. "Kallan," she corrected again, and fools are meant for smiling at. "Fool!" Dagon wiped the moisture from his amber eyes and dabbed at the blood on his nose. "You're the one sitting on your arse." Kallan widened her grin. "You're the one with your guard down." She flicked her wrist and sage flame burst to life in her hand. "By Balder," Dagon cursed, and leapt, taking up a round shield from the wall as Kallan sent her scythe streaming for Dagon's torso. Neither saw King Olaf standing in the door. Fire rolled off the edge of the wood while Dagon cowered behind the shield. Kallan's flames grew hotter. "Kallan!" Dagon shouted. "Kallan, stand down!" Olaf ordered, and Kallan extinguished her flame, doing her best to already hide her waning strength. "Do you yield?" she asked, staring at the shield charred black. "No!" Dagon said, and he threw the wood at Kallan. Dagon raised her arm and caught the shield. Kallan raised her arm and caught the shield with her elbow. Blocks of blackened charcoal fell to the floor, and Dagon charged, his sword positioned to impale Kallan as she mustered the last of her strength, readied her scythe, and braced for the impact. Sweeping her feet out from under her, Eyolf dropped Kallan to the ground in a pile. "First rule of battle, Kallan," Eyolf said, putting his full weight onto her. "Don't turn your back to your opponent." "Gah!" Kallan shouted, squirming beneath the floor and her father. "Say it," Eyolf said, indifferent to his daughter's wheezing. "No! Out!" Kallan bellowed. "Quit squirming and say it." Kallan raised her head to Dagon, who threw back his head and laughed, then sheathed his sword. "You're next, Dagon," she said. "Now help me up so I can kick your eye." Dagon threw his arms to the air. "I can't help you, princess. My orders come from the king." "And why is that, Kallan?" Eyolf said, as if they were seated in the war room. "Why do Dagon's orders come from the king?" Kallan slapped the floor, doing her best to pull herself out from under her father, but the scythe left her too weak to fight him. "Because," Kallan gasped, "Dagon is your captain?" "That's right," Eyolf said, patting her head like a dog. Kallan growled. "And what am I?" Eyolf said. "I won't say it!" "Say it, Kallan." "No!" Eyolf picked his foot up off the floor, adding more of his weight to her. "Ugh!" Kallan dropped her head and answered into the floor. "You're my king." "Good girl," Eyolf said with a victorious grin. "And no!" "Give in, Kallan," Dagon shouted over Kallan's screams. "You're overspent your energy again, using too much of your scythe on me. You've exhausted yourself because you lack the endurance to fight. And besides," the king said, shifting his weight, "my backside has you pinned to the floor. Now say it." "I won't!" "Say it," Eyolf said patiently. "Never!" Kallan punched the floor and winced. "Say that you eat dragon dung," Eyolf instructed. "No!" "Say it!" Eyolf gave a light bounce. "Squish me!" Kallan gasped and relaxed on the floor. Eyolf smiled. "Stubborn," he said, and pulled himself up, leaving Kallan free to stand. Kallan didn't move. Her breathing punched the air as she lay. "You can't rely on your scythe," Dagon said, attempting to wipe some of the blood away with his sleeve. "I can," Kallan gasped. "Not until you work up your endurance," Eyolf said. Kallan lay, focusing on the sage she felt brewing inside her. Brewing, but locked somehow, as if in a vault somewhere deep within. "I can do this," she said. "There's more in me. I just can't." Kallan brushed the long brown locks from her face. "I can't get to it." "You're not Gudrun yet, Kallan," Eyolf answered. Kallan cringed at the severity in his voice. "You can hardly hold a stream longer than a handful of minutes, and when you do, it leaves you exhausted." Kallan rolled her head to the side to better look upon Dagon. "Dagon, tell him. I will forever side with my king, princess." Kallan corrected. "You always side with him." "As it should be," Eyolf added. "Until you are queen," Dagon said. "My services belong to the king. I'm going to see Gudrun to fix my nose, then I'll ready the horses. My liege?" Dagon nodded to Eyolf and winked at Kallan. "Princess?" "Kallan!" she shouted after the captain, who'd already left the barracks. Dagon threw his hand to the air in goodbye. "When you are queen, princess, that can be your first order to me." Kallan sighed and turned her head to the rafters. "Stubborn." "Like you," Eyolf said, and took Kallan's hand, helping her to her feet. "Eyolf doesn't call me princess," she said, combing her hair from her face. "Eyolf is a boy who doesn't fight in the service of his king," Eyolf said. Kallan collected her hair, then gave it a snap so that it fell in an orderly fashion down her back. "Well," she said, picking her sword up from the floor. Eyolf arched his brow too noticeably. Well? He asked. You're hiding something. With her skirt, she wiped down the blade and studied the elding steel closely. Unlike the iron blades, hers remained without chipping. You came to the barracks for a reason, and seeing as how you didn't follow Dane to the stables. That obvious, huh? Only to me, Kallan said, and sheathed her sword. Noting the delay her father was relishing, she picked up a bit of broken shield and turned over the black bit of charcoal. We're meeting with King Tryggve for the festival, he said at last. Kallan looked up from the wood. We are. She waited, holding her attention on him. Eric's done a lot of work arranging this holiday with the Liasafar. He has. Kallan didn't flinch. They kept out of our way while we... Kallan watched her father inhale uncomfortably, not daring to meet her eyes. We invaded their land in a way. We were vulnerable. They could have wiped us out without any trouble, and didn't. He rubbed his beard, black and streaked with silver, once, twice. Father. Huh? You're evading. Eyolf furrowed his brow. I'm not. You are. You're using that tone you use when you're hoping I won't notice you're evading if you use just the right flux in your voice. Eyolf pinched the end of his beard and thought. I have no flux. You flux. I don't think I flux, he said. You flux. Out with it, Kallan said. Eyolf scratched his forehead. Well, you're about the same age your mother was when she and I... Kallan continued to peer over the charcoal. I'm just saying, you're almost old enough to... She didn't move. Just try to look nice for the holiday, Eyolf finished. Kallan arched a single brow. Do I not look nice? Eyolf frowned. Do I get to bring my sword? Kallan asked, deciding to rescue him from having to answer that question. If you wish, he said. All right then. Kallan wasn't convinced. You know, Tryggve has 2 sons, Eyolf rattled off. Kallan felt the blood leave her face. That's what you wanted to discuss? I'm just saying they may not be... Kallan dropped the charcoal to the floor and tried pulling a groan on top of the rising pit in her chest. Kallan, you're well past the age to be thinking about marriage, Eyolf said, and a marriage would do well to unite our kingdoms with Gunir. I don't have time for boys, she said. I have lessons, and... the lessons! You have time for Eilif, Eyolf said. Well, Eilif is different. Kallan stared into the courtyard. A warm breeze blew through the barracks, tousling her hair with her skirts. In another year, you'll have less of a choice, Eyolf said. In another 2, you'll have no choice. We have very little options available, and those boys are about your age. How much older? She asked, turning her head from the door. 5, 10 years older? I'm not sure. They're old, she muttered, knowing her father wouldn't believe her lie, but trying anyway. I'm old, Eyolf said. You've reached your elding, she said, and felt a bit grateful he had waited until Dagon had left to discuss this matter with her. And soon so will you, as will Tryggve's sons. The aging will stop, and it won't matter your age from theirs. Kallan released a slow breath, knowing she had little room to argue. The political advantage was too clear. Kallan nodded. So, you want me to look nice? Okay, that concludes Chapter 4. And tune in later, we will have Chapter 5, as well as a stop-in with Latoya Wilson as I read an excerpt from her site. Thank you very much.